You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
I studied business administration, specialized in finance management, and was actually trained as a banker. I moved to East Africa, where I started to work on the nexus between rural development, food value chains, and how do we mobilize investments to make food systems work in Africa. We believe that agriculture value chains are very complex ecosystems that connect different stakeholders, actors, and key decision makers. How do you scale them so that they're not only impacting 5,000 or 10,000 farmers, but 5 million.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Jennifer Baarn, who is the head of partnerships at AGRA, which is an alliance led by Africans with roots in farming communities across the continent and puts smallholder farmers at the center of the continent's growing economy. Welcome to the podcast, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's really good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I was hoping before we get into the conversation, you could please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Jennifer.
Well, thank you. So I'm Jennifer Baarn. I'm living currently in Nairobi in Kenya. And I'm, of course, the head of partnerships at AGRA, as you just explained. Well, if we have to go way back, I was born and raised in South America, Suriname, small country next to Brazil. Not a lot of people know us unless you are really into soccer. You would know all the great soccer players from the Netherlands are actually from Suriname. I rub off on some of their fame. And yes, but I went to the Netherlands to study. I studied business administration, specialized in finance management, and was actually trained as a banker at Rabobank International. That's where the interest and admiration for the food and agriculture sector comes from. But I was very much interested in working in emerging markets. And of course, Africa as the continent of my ancestors was almost like an obvious area of focus. And so I decided after the banking crisis to make a career switch and first moved to Switzerland to work for the World Economic Forum. But really, after a few years, I moved to East Africa, where I started to work on the nexus between rural development, food value chains, and how do we mobilize investments to make food systems work in Africa, from the smallholder farmers to governments to SMEs to major corporations. How do we get more investments in Africa? That's really the question that intrigues me. And I'm working for AGRA as the head of partnerships.
Fantastic. So you've given us a nice overview in terms of your early career that has led you to work within AGRA. So I was hoping you can just give us a very brief overview regarding AGRA, what it does, its mission within Africa.
Yes, absolutely. So AGRA was established as almost a partnership organization more than 2 decades ago by the late Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN. And it really came from a quest that was bothering him. We are all familiar with the Green Revolution that occurred in the 70s and 80s across the Americas and in Asia, and really increased yield and productivity in the agriculture sector, making a lot of communities food self-sufficient. But somehow it seemed to have skipped Africa. African farmers were still at the low end in terms of access to technology, being it seed, fertilizer, etc., access to know-how, and therefore also with low productivity. So his quest was really, how can we establish a green revolution in Africa? And he mobilized a few funding partners, and he came to the conclusion that he had to establish an African-owned organization in Africa with some of the best minds on the continent on this topic to help catalyze an African green revolution. Now, we've learned a lot in our existence, of course. Initially, we very much focused a lot on access to seed technology, better seeds, better training for farmers, better research in terms of what type of technologies would work better for farmers. But we've learned that if you really want to make a shift, you need to have a food systems focus. So we also work a lot with governments in terms of policy. We work with financial institutions and basically across the value chain to make it work. What is our mission? What do we want to do? Of course, we are very keen to ensure that we have sustainable food systems across Africa. And what does that mean? That means that smallholder farmers are empowered to produce sufficient healthy food, but also are able to generate a sustainable income. And we really do it by initiating programs, as well as working with other partners and leveraging their activities to make things happen.
Brilliant. So you've given us a comprehensive overview of AGRA. So if we look at your role specifically as the head of partnerships at AGRA, what are some of the flagship programs that have been implemented to promote partnerships across the agriculture space on the continent?
A very good question. So the partnerships at AGRA luckily don't only rest with the head of partnerships. We do acknowledge that if you want to shift food systems in Africa, you really need to work with a wide range of actors. So even the whole setup of AGRA is a partnership in terms of our different funders are collected in a consortium called PIATA, the partnership to initiate African agriculture transformation. So for us, partnership is really in our DNA. And there are several things that we, for example, do. We mitigate risk in value chains by consolidating farmers and helping to bridge the last mile towards them in terms of products that need to reach them and other type of information. In order to do so, we partner with quite a number of institutions, companies, etc., to make sure that it actually happens. We also partner at the offtake side to create linkages to market. Another type of partnership that we also initiate is an advocacy and a voice on priorities in food systems transformation for the African continent. So annually, we organize the largest conference in Africa on food systems transformation called the AGRA. And it's visited by 3,000 people, from corporate leaders to program implementers, political leaders, etc. And that's a consortium of 26 partners to make that happen. So both in terms of how we implement our projects, as well as our advocacy, as well as how we work with governments, doing this in collaboration is actually quite critical. My role specifically is that in the past 5 years, I've really focused on strengthening and mobilizing the private sector partnerships of AGRA, making sure that we strengthen also our advocacy by partnering with actors across the world. We recently initiated a lot of South-South collaboration, both in the Americas with ICA as well as in Asia. And also to make sure that our partners can leverage the investments that AGRA is making in the programs that we're implementing across 15 countries in Africa.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that partnership is in AGRA's DNA. So if we look at partnerships within local farming on the continent, from your experience, what partnerships do you believe are needed for local farming communities to understand their specific agricultural needs?
So what type of partnerships are required to understand the agricultural needs in local farmer communities? We believe that agriculture value chains are very complex ecosystems that connect different stakeholders, actors, and key decision makers. But I think first and foremost, the focus on and the partnering with the farmer is very critical. How do you convene farmers? How do you engage with them? What type of partnerships do you actually build with farmer corporations, the associations, and their representative bodies? I think that is number one, and that I think is also one of the unique aspects of how AGRA operates. Number two, acknowledging all the different actors and stakeholders in the ecosystem around farmers, from local governments to the SMEs that they work with, the financial institutions, etc. So what we're often trying to do is mitigate risk in these value chains by partnering with a series of different actors who are relevant for the farmers from the moment they basically buy their inputs to the moment that they actually are selling their produce off farm. So it's very difficult to pinpoint and say, only a partnership with the government is critical or is a priority. I think if we put the farmers at the center and basically see who are really the key decision maker and actors within their ecosystem, yes. A series of partnerships actually emerge. It's often an area that is not fully understood. See, when I worked in the so-called developed world, in the banking sector, I worked in mergers and acquisitions, connecting, buying and selling companies, etc. And to me, it was fascinating when I came to Africa that actually a profession and a facilitation and a coordination of our whole sector that was seen as a standalone profession with loads of investments in many development countries that we often expect when we come to an East African agriculture value chain, that many of these connections just happen spontaneously and everything will just work out as long as we just put people in one meeting once a year or once a quarter. No, you have to invest in coordination and value chain and ecosystem connection as well.
Beautiful. So you mentioned that agricultural supply chains are extremely complex. With these complexities come challenges. So what would you say are some of the major challenges faced by local farmers in areas as you detailed in terms of sustainable agricultural practices?
The challenges have been well researched. And the challenges are known and all this, finding solutions is not always that straightforward. But I think first and foremost, challenges has often to do with the farmers themselves in terms of level of education, even the choice that they have made to become a farmer. Many of the farmers are farmers by default. Many are women in disempowered position. The age of our farmers is also increasing. There are not a lot of young people that necessarily attracted to farming. So basically, farmers themselves are often just challenged to connect to information and are empowered to have access to those services and goods, etc., that would benefit them. And then, of course, the challenge is just access to capital. The cost of capital is relatively high in our markets, and even in the agriculture sector that has been seen as high risk, it's even a bigger challenge. Farming in Africa is also very, very fragmented. And that's also one of the areas where we're actually intensively working on is how can we address some of that fragmentation, lower the risk, and also provide insight to financial institutions to better work with farmer communities. And therefore, having access to inputs, so to say, is a challenge. Another challenge, last mile infrastructure. Although we have made significant improvements, the average farmer in Africa still has to travel kilometers to have access to some of the basic inputs such as seed, fertilizer, pesticides, etc. And even when they do, they lack the proper services to educate them how to use this efficiently and impactful. So it's almost like a vicious circle or a series of challenges that our farmers are facing that are not allowing them to be empowered enough to also turn the cycle of not only poverty, but also often food insecurity. Lastly, I would like to state access to market. Often also linked to broader challenges that we see in the overall economy, call it a lack of proper infrastructure, being it roads, warehouses, but also think about information technology. So as a farmer, even if you've overcome all the different challenges to have access to proper input, linking to market actually then becomes another challenge. So many of these challenges have been well documented. What is a challenge is what type of business model, supply chain model will support us in basically fixing some of these challenges. That is one. And even if we do find models, we work with a number of partners who try to address these challenges. How do you scale them so that they're not only impacting 5,000 or 10,000 farmers, but 5 million? So those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with.
You mentioned something key in terms of young people not being interested in farming, also the cost of capital. So what strategies have you seen that work that ensure that partnerships are inclusive and considerate of gender and social equity in farming communities?
Very important question, because if we just look at the rate of two things, for the demographics as well as urbanization, we know that we're heading towards a continent and community that will A, have a high demand for food, B, but also will have a high demand for jobs. And still, since 80% of our world population is still in some way dependent on the agriculture sector, it's very important that agriculture can become a catalyst for both food security as well as generating income, jobs, and economic prosperity. So what initiatives are we taking? I think that, like across the board, gender and youth engagement and involvement is very important. But some of the things that we see is that we often lack the information and the data to even start addressing and calculating the problem and what the gaps are. So one of the things that we have done as AGRA is, together with governments and other partners, have started to do an ecosystem mapping in specific countries. We started with Senegal and Rwanda to see what are the challenges and the gaps and the bottlenecks that are preventing young people from becoming agri-entrepreneurs. And of course, there are a range of challenges that need to be addressed, some that I have already shared earlier. So one, bringing the information to the table. And secondly, supporting governments and partners to design flagship programs that can address the challenges that you are facing in terms of accessing and building or establishing agriculture companies. Of course, basically, I think a lot of institutions are making sure that they have their quotas and their numbers when it comes to youth and women engagement. For example, for many of our programs, it's mandatory to have 40% women farmers involved. But we also have to be a lot more proactive than that. One of the things that we've done, for example, we've established a value for her, which is as AGRA, we're promoting and driving this, which is a matchmaking and education platform for women entrepreneurs in agriculture. And we do a couple of things. Of course, we build their capacity, provide training, etc. But we also connect them to an agribusiness deal room that matches them with financial institutions and investors to grow their business, or with larger and potential clients that they can leverage. So actively playing a role in cultivating and incubating youth entrepreneurship and supporting them around their growth path is definitely something that becomes more important. Lastly, I would like to say, farming and agriculture in general doesn't have a good reputation. But when we engage with youth, we see a lot of enthusiasm for other parts of the value chain. Think about fintech and other type of digital services that can be provided to the food value chain. We look at food processing, nutrition, etc. And bringing awareness to these opportunities, supporting youth in gaining insights into training on some of these levels is quite important. But most importantly, supporting them in accessing finance. So those are some of the critical things that I see happening and that are quite important to focus on.
Extremely insightful. Earlier, you mentioned the challenge of access to markets. So from your perspective, how important is the formation of partnerships to, say, enable cross-border collaboration to stimulate regional agriculture?
Oh, it's extremely important. I have the privilege sometimes to work with some of the best youth entrepreneurs across Africa. We even have awards and prizes that we provide to them every year. We have a Generation Africa platform that mobilizes thousands of youths in agriculture. And I had the opportunity to speak to one of these brilliant minds and ask them, what is your elevator pitch? If I'm speaking to your minister tomorrow, what is your elevator pitch in terms of what it is that you require? Their support on. And he said, that's very easy. One, access to finance, you already mentioned that. Two, interestingly, access to packaging. With packaging, you also unlock the third bottleneck better, which is access to regional markets. So if we want to grow food companies in Africa, it's inevitable that we have to focus on creating an African consumer market. So the African Continental Free Trade Area initiative by the EU states, for which they have already made the first strides, it's critical to make sure that actually we unlock these opportunities in our agriculture and food sector. As AGRA, we have invested in yet another partnership, the Regional Food Balance Sheet, because what we often see is policies, behavior from decision makers in politics that are actually adverse to creating or harmonizing an internal market. So we've created a Regional Food Balance Sheet, and what that does, with a consortium of partners, we're collecting information on the status of food production, availability of food in a country, regional trade, etc. All the detailed data that improves the decision-making of key policymakers so that we don't get knee-jerk reactions, such as the closure of borders. If there's shortage in one part of Tanzania, but there's overproduction in another part, We also basically give more insights into where new opportunities are for increased regional trade. For example, trying to project or predict where we will have increased demand of certain food commodities in other parts of the region, and also actively facilitating and supporting governments and companies to leverage this information.
So you mentioned the support that you provide, such as access to inputs and packaging. So how does AGRA help farmers access these inputs in a sustainable and equitable manner?
Just to correct, we don't provide access to packaging. These were just the top 3 bottlenecks that a young entrepreneur in the dairy sector from Uganda shared with me, that if this was resolved, that would really catalyze his business. But how do we support farmers in accessing markets, being regional or being international? So there's several key things that we're doing. Number one, I spoke about the last mile delivery gap that farmers face, right? And it's not only for inputs, it's also a last mile challenge that they have when it comes to supplying to markets. It's difficult to reach farmers. They're often fragmented, and just in terms of physical reaching them, it's a challenge because there's a lack of warehousing, etc. So what is it that we do? First of all, we're trying to mitigate the risk by consolidating farmers, which means it's easier for different larger market parties to engage with them. We call these farmer hubs that we're building consortia. Around these consortia, we're building village-based advisory, input agents who are providing them with inputs, but we're also building an inclusive finance mechanism that links buyers to financial institutions, to input providers, to farmers. That at least already starts mitigating a lot of the risk, both from the input and supply side. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Number 2, we're also mobilizing buyers to engage with farmers. For example, we had a partnership with Nestle and some of its local processors, so the first line of processors engaging with farmers. And the focus was not even in Nestle as a final off-taker. It was on the companies that it was working with in Ghana and Nigeria who were sourcing from farmers. And we built a partnership where actually we had placed agents and traders in between who helped to coordinate and close that value chain loop. And that was really impactful in that sense, in terms of providing farmers with the right products so that they could actually deliver the quality of supply and the volume that was required by these processes. Another thing that we're doing, we're matching buyers in other markets to farming communities. So our matchmaking platforms are not just only to match SMEs to financial institutions and investors, but we also match farmer corporations to potential buyers in other countries. So those are some of the things that we're actually doing. Lastly, what we also do, we realize more and more that the so-called hidden middle in food and agriculture value chains, many of the SMEs who are traders and primary processors, but also other facilitators like transport companies, etc., are critical in terms of unlocking market opportunities for farmers. So we're more and more also focusing on how can we build their capacity, how can we help them to get access to finance and link to even bigger clients and solve some of their capital investments so that they then can source more from farmers.
Brilliant. You mentioned some key points such as last mile challenges, fragmentation of farmers, and your work in consolidating farmers. What role would you say technology and innovation play in advancing these activities?
Technology is very critical, digital technology. If you only see the revolution that India actually caused in East Africa when it was first introduced, unlocking the access of many rural communities to financial flows, I would say digital technology is very critical in terms of making sure that farmer communities have access to data information. You can imagine about market prices, about potential buyers, having secure platforms to basically trade. I think in that sense that digital technology and also fintech specifically can really have an important impact on unlocking market opportunities for farmers. But I also think other type of technology is very critical. In terms of storage, lowering waste and cooling, that has become very critical. We know the problem of aflatoxin in many of our food value chains, from groundnuts to maize, etc. It will take technology and innovation in how we store goods and how we grow them to basically address that. But even a step further in terms of also seed technology. Right. So technology is actually quite critical to unlock many of these opportunities. However, it's not just the technology per se that is critical. I keep on mentioning it. It's the business model in which you wrap it and deliver it to the farmer that is also critical. So we have to look at models that are sustainable, that are affordable, and are there for the long term. How will we get this technology to the farmer in a way that they can easily understand it and incorporate it into their day-to-day practices, and that they can afford it and pay for it, and that they can also build on the new information and knowledge and actually feed into newer designs that work for them. But how do we also design models where we almost harvest or consult local farmer communities in terms of what works with them? In the end, no matter how impoverished, our farmers are entrepreneurs in their own right. They are consumers of products, goods, and services. And when designing technology, etc., and services, we have to also have an inclusive and consultative process in terms of what their needs are and what they are bringing to the table.
Brilliant. So during our conversation, we've detailed partnerships with youth and a range of local communities. So if we look outside of the local communities in terms of how AGRA collaborates with government and policymakers, what role do you believe governments and policymakers have in creating and enabling agricultural environments in African countries?
I would say it's a critical role, of course. Governments are basically responsible for literally the environment in which many of these value chains operate. And it's from everything like basic services in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of the investment climate. Unfortunately, when it comes to the investment climate for agriculture, many of our countries are not scoring very high. From general issues such as red tape, corruption, but also lack of investments by governments, right, itself in the agriculture sector specifically, but also in infrastructure, and also the challenges of doing businesses. And I think unpredictable policies are probably also a big challenge. I speak to many investors, and it's often shared that, as long as we know what we're dealing with, we can manage the risk because it's all about predictability. But if at every annual budget review, policies change significantly, it makes it very difficult to operate in that environment. So governments play a very critical role, all the way from central governments, of course, to regional governments. And it's not only in the negative, it's often also in the positive. I've worked with regional governments who were at the forefront of mobilizing investors to invest, both regional as well as investors from outside of the continent to invest in their regions and create jobs in the agriculture sector. So quite important. How do we work as AGRA with governments? On different levels. And yes, we work heavily in advocacy, but we see ourselves also as partners of governments and support them as well in terms of mapping challenges, defining flagship together with the private sector and local stakeholders, also in mobilizing funding to translate the flagships into actual bankable projects and investments. But we're also there at the implementation side to co-invest and to support governments as well. So quite intensely.
So you've mentioned the importance of government in agriculture. Are there any successful policy changes or interventions that you've witnessed that have created a more enabling agricultural environment?
Yes, I do think quite a number of measures are being taken. Thinking very specifically, first of all, just on a continental level, right? The Africa Continental Free Trade Area that was announced. I think that's a step in the right directions and the measures that are being taken. It's still going way too slow. I think the intent is quite important. On a government level, we do also see good steps that are being taken. For example, we worked with the government of Kenya during the COVID period to basically create almost like a war room in terms of food security and sustainability and generate all the data and the insights that are required to make important decisions. So there are a couple of measures that are being taken that are positive. We have worked also with a number of governments in terms of their trade policy, especially the predictability of their trade policies. I think of countries like Tanzania. We have worked with the government of Ethiopia in terms of designing flagships and strategy in terms of the agriculture sector. So yes, there are positive movements that are happening, but I think overall the bigger picture, there's still a few deficits that we see in terms of how governments are operating. Many of the governments are not honoring the Malabo Declaration that called for a 10% investment of the government budget into agriculture. We also see that if you look at the biannual review of CAADP, the Common Agriculture Development Policy of the African Union, that only one country is on track in terms of achieving its goals, which is Rwanda. Many of the countries not are in the red. So there's still a lot that governments can do, both on a bigger picture scale as well as in specific policy revisions.
Yes. So if we move from government and look at, say, the intersection between public and private sector, what role do you believe partnerships between public and private sector can play in boosting agriculture in Africa?
Yeah, I think on different levels. First of all, it's inevitable. I think Africa's food systems transformation has to be private sector led and government facilitated. So both critical roles, but it inevitably will have to be private sector led. And private sector led are most of the actors in the value chain. Everybody who puts their own capital and resources at risk, from our smallholder farmers to our SMEs, the traders, and also the larger corporates and companies. So being partners in this transformation and development is critical. And it's not easy. Governments and other stakeholders in the private sector often have, different types of language, focus, intention. So facilitating that public-private dialogue, I think it's the first step. We should continue to invest in that. And we strongly believe in that, as well as AGRA, and support a lot of dialogues, not only the large conference that we organize, but also on a national level. We do facilitate that public-private dialogue. Secondly, then, in terms of co-designing, for many of the flagships that we support governments in designing, whether it's a flagship for women empowerment or a youth entrepreneurship or a flagship for a specific value chain, we strongly engage the private sector and quite a number of different stakeholders. So that is really important. But then when it also comes to the area of co-investing, I think that's where the rubber hits the road. And too often we see that governments assign a plan and then invest in a road here and invest and builds a plant in a completely different direction. And then we have development partners who are building a farmer program in a completely different direction. So how do you coordinate all of these different efforts and make them complementary? We haven't discovered a silver bullet yet, but it's very, very critical to continue to push for that alignment and coordination. And I think that if it comes very specifically to the type of joint ventures and public partnerships when it comes to investments, really, there's still a lot of legislation across African countries that can be improved in that sense to make it easier for governments to attract private sector investments into being it special economic zones, specific hubs, or even proper PPP initiatives. So very important and to be facilitated on so many different levels.
Brilliant. You've detailed the private sector is important. One of the factors is that the private sector do put their own capital at risk. So if we look at capital or finance, from your knowledge, what are some examples of innovative financing mechanisms that are being explored to support or finance agriculture within Africa?
There are quite a number. I think that when it comes to innovative financing mechanisms, blended finance, for example, really took a flight in the past 10 years. We've seen a wide range of guarantee funds, blended finance mechanisms, which includes guarantee funds, but also the increase of social impact funds, right? Which is often a combination of public funding coming from different sources and private capital that is being invested. We have seen a lot of programs and mechanisms being designed. And I think a latest category is around the whole insurance space, right? And then the supporting digital technology that often comes with many of these mechanisms. We have seen a lot of innovation. I think often the challenge is that we haven't invested as much in building the pipeline of bankable projects to receive a lot of this funding. And this is also one of the reasons why as AGRA we established the Agribusiness Deal Room 4 years ago. We've built a $5 billion pipeline, not only private projects, but also public-private projects from more than 15 governments that are all seeking capital and different ways of investments and funding. So from my perspective, we are progressing in terms of designing the instruments, understanding how better to deploy them. Where the challenge is basically building that pipeline and then matching that with the available funds. We too often hear from, be it financial institutions, investors, development institutions, that often the targets and the demand of capital across the continent is too small, too fragmented, high risk. So we're not there yet.
Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned about building that pipeline. I'm not sure if this is something that you can answer, but what qualifies someone or an entity to be added to the pipeline?
It's a good question. And I like the way how you actually frame that question, because the answer is that everybody, from startups to mature companies that either want to expand or make their business a lot more inclusive, right? If you build a business and you say, listen, I'm now only sourcing from 2,000 farmers, I would love to source from 50,000 farmers, but I need support, partners, capital to do so. In principle, everybody should. If you look at financial markets that are highly developed and very sophisticated, there is funding available for different stages of development, different levels of complexity, different risk appetites, etc. I think where we struggle here is a lack of visibility and the challenge of just the overall enabling environment where information and risk appetite, projects and opportunities don't necessarily match. And you have to understand that actually often doing a 50 million transaction requires as much man hours, legal services, as sometimes doing a 5 million transaction.
True.
So many investors and financial institutions lean towards the low-hanging fruit, what is easy to fund, instead of necessarily looking at how do we then really address the challenge of working with the most fragmented ends of the market. And then, the elephant in the room has to do with basically the cost of capital in our countries that is often also driven by government budgets that they have outstanding. So sometimes it feels like a vicious circle or a chicken and egg discussion, but we have seen the appetite to find a solution. We have on various levels ourselves invested in innovative lending models. As I mentioned before, the challenge is often how do you scale them? For example, we have a blended finance mechanism with 3 banks in Mali. It's not even on a bigger scale. We have dispersed $250 million roughly. But through SMEs and different actors, it has impacted 30,000 farmers. So the question is, how can we scale some of these models up? And how do we catalyze? How do we do more in bigger volumes and faster?
Thank you for that. Earlier, you mentioned the trends that you're seeing in blended finance and insurance mechanisms. So if we stick to the theme of trends, what are some of the positive trends that you're seeing from the work with regards to, say, partnerships in African agriculture?
What are some of the trends that I'm seeing? I think compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the acknowledgement that no single actor can do it alone. And the acknowledgement that we're operating and working in silos. Investments, especially public investments coming from development partners or governments in Africa, traditionally have often been silo operations, right? And often short-term as well. 4 5-year programs, 3-year programs implemented in a specific region, not necessarily connected to other investments or activities by other actors, and therefore not necessarily being as impactful or efficient as they could be. I think there's a growing acknowledgement that that is not the model going forward. So the quest by different institutions, companies, and actors to basically look for partnerships to address certain solutions that is genuine, that's real, and that has scaled up. So I think that is a positive development because in the end, it's about behavior of people and decisions that they're making. Secondly, I think the level of urgency has, of course, increased with the crisis that we have from COVID to the Ukraine-Russia crisis, but definitely also the impact of climate change. I mean, the volatility and the disruption that it brings to our food and agriculture sectors has really switched on the light bulb everywhere, that we have to work in partnership, that we have to consolidate, we have to create critical mass in order to address some of these challenges, and especially that many of these challenges are cross-border, also within the regional African market. The how we do it is not necessarily always there. Of course, the solutions are not always straightforward, but that we have to do it and that governments and the private sector have to work together, I think that acknowledgement is definitely there. What do we see happening moving forward? I truly hope, and we see that effort being taken in different countries, that we move closer towards two things. One is the breadbasket approach. And breadbaskets, by definition, cross-border. It's just where are the dominant agro ecosystems across the continent that if we develop them well and target them well, we'll be able to feed the continent. And how do we mobilize focus and resources around these breadbaskets? So I think that's number one. Number two, the other trend that I see is the genuine interest in creating agro hubs. It's more than just an economic zone where you attract a couple of manufacturers to, but how do we genuinely build agro hubs that have the proper infrastructure, that have inclusive farming business models, and where we also have a proper integration of government leadership on the other side and private sector as well. For example, in Tanzania, we have the SECA, the Southern Agriculture Growth Corridor that was established. We have the Beira Corridor in Mozambique. So all these efforts and how and where do we build these agro hubs is increasing. Thirdly, also in terms of trends of partnerships, how can we more efficiently deploy finance? If you look at, for example, mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund that was put in place to provide seed and catalytic funding for all kinds of initiatives, but it's so difficult to access by African governments and their stakeholders, we have to redesign some of these mechanisms, and it will require a partnership approach where government will partner with different actors to make sure that we disseminate funding a lot quicker. And then I think also just closer to the farmer, you have to imagine if you are a farmer, let's say Kiamu State here in Kenya, you might as well be engaged in 4 or 5 different programs who are all training and providing you with input and access to markets, etc. But so how do we actually, as institutions who are implementing many of these programs, how do we better coordinate and collaborate? And I think digital technology will play a big role into that. Lastly, big data.
Yes.
We are really, really making fundamental decisions about the life of a few billion Africans based on really limited data and information, from a regional level all the way to even district level. And that has to change. And we only will be able to do that if we work in partnerships. So we will also see a lot more opportunities emerging in those areas.
Fantastic. You've given great insight into current trends and where you see African agriculture in the future from a partnership perspective. So if we look closer to home, what partnership work will AGRA be doing in, say, 5 years' time?
That's a very interesting question. Hopefully retired.
I think you've got many more decades before retirement.
No, but what to do, when you basically had all your dream jobs before the age of 50 and you lived in the places you wanted to live, what's next?
Exactly, yeah. You need to buy that beach house.
Can you imagine? I know. Let's first see what my husband will be saying. My husband is a chef and he runs a restaurant. So we're both in the food sector, but completely different. So one of my challenges, at least in the coming 5 years, is to learn how to make a few traditional dishes from home in the proper way. No, but that's just funny. On a serious note, a couple of things. I've gone through a very interesting site in terms of career. Starting in banking and then moving to really like the global level and the World Economic Forum, and then this, not really descending, but moving closer to the action. For me, in the coming 5 years, I want to move closer to the key decision making, especially around fund flows. I do believe that this importance of aligning how we invest in the agriculture sector is so critical. And with all the expertise and knowledge that I have gained in terms of what type of business models works, etc., I want to get closer to where the decision in terms of the funding is being made. So that might be an interesting journey. I don't know how that will evolve. Where do I see AGRA? Very interesting as well. I see the role of AGRA as shifting towards a core convener in this ecosystem. Because as mentioned, and that's definitely the mantra of a partnership person, you need honest brokers in the system. You need facilitators, you need connectors, you need actors who help to catalyze. Implementation is already done by so many different actors, but who connects the dots and who has the convening power to bring the top 10 key decision makers in Africa's food and agriculture sector together? A few years ago, when we were in Ghana in 2018, in the agribusiness deal room at the AGRA, we had a session about animal feed and the poultry sector in that conference. And we invited quite a number of investors, financial institutions, etc. And we realized at one point in time after we started doing the math that we had almost 10% of the investments under asset in that room.
Wow.
That is a wow indeed. And the call from them was actually quite clear. They said, listen, you all, institutions like AGRA and TechnoServe, etc., you have a fantastic program, but A, they're not solving all the issues, B, they're not necessarily have the critical mass of where we see the potential of the sector. So being able to unlock those conversations, but also coordinate and broker that we have some significant investments and actions going in the continent, I see that as becoming more and more critical. In the end, on this continent, we will need to have some significant Marshall Plan level type of investments and shifts in how we deal with the food and ag sector on the continent. And I do see an important role for a number of critical institutions in that respect. I think AGRA can definitely play a role in that. So convene, broker, facilitate, encourage the public-private dialogue, but also towards design of bankable projects and implementation, very critical.
I agree.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
I think so. I have several.
Brilliant.
I have really, really several on a personal level, etc. But one thing that has kept me going, and I think also drives part of my passion of why I'm here and in this sector doing this well, is the world begins in Africa. The world begins in Africa. I tell people, if you want to know how to run anything, right? You have to on this continent. If you want to be at the frontier of new development and transformation, you have to be on this continent. Historically speaking, we know the world began in Africa. So yeah, the world begins in Africa.
Beautiful. I like that very much. So we're coming to the end of today's conversation. I was wondering if you had any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing or just interested in African agriculture partnerships in general.
Absolutely. I think build any skill set in any industry when it comes to food systems transformation in Africa and building this $1 trillion industry that the World Bank predicted we can build on this continent. You will have to work in partnership with others. So building the skill set to establish collaborative efforts in any part of a value chain is so critical. And it's what really will unlock opportunities and growth on this continent. So wherever you are, partner, collaborate, disseminate information and intelligence. Thank you.
Beautiful. What a way to end today's conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've enjoyed discussing all aspects of African agriculture and partnerships. So thank you for joining me on the podcast today, Jennifer.
Yeah, it was very nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll speak soon.
Yes, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.